Visible to all of you?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Excellent. So
Yes,
first
sir.
of all, thank you, Reed, for helping me. First of all, welcome to this online international winter school program of IMPRI. This is going to be 2 months of immersive online certificate training course. And we underline the word immersive because here it's going to be intensive discussions with scholars of great experience and reputation. And all of you must make sure you have a takeaway from this. You must make sure that you're using your time in engaging these number of scholars and that will be coming to speak to you. So make it as immersive as possible for your own advantage. You can ask as many questions. In fact, I always believe that when participants make comments or ask questions, that is a more useful exercise because the speaker then knows what exactly is the area of interest that a participant has. Otherwise, each of the speakers will come and make a general presentation on. We largely are talking about diplomacy and foreign policy, and the focus this time, as was mentioned, will be on towards Viksit Bharat or developed India. Today, since it is an opening inaugural interaction, I will be generally speaking to you on the broader theme of diplomacy and foreign policy, more largely on diplomacy and how diplomacy is different from foreign policy. At Jawaharlal Nehru University, I am now the professor for diplomacy and disarmament. So I'm delighted to open the discussion today. And this will be followed with very, very excellent presentations from now on. First question that this cohort must ask themselves or answer for themselves is what is the need to study foreign policy? I mean, there is so much to learn. Some of you may be interested in horticulture. Some of you may be interested in classical music. Some of you may be interested in economics or geography or even social sciences disciplines of a whole range. Why do we need to focus on foreign policy is the first question that all of you need to understand. First, quick, easy answer is that world is getting very rapidly interconnected. Thanks to infusion of technology, all of us, you, me, everybody is becoming extremely, extremely connected. If you imagine your grandparents' connection, if they had about 200-300 people as friends, they were celebrities. I mean, they were really very, very important people to know 200 people. Now, each of you may be knowing thousands of people who are connected to you on social media, and you're sharing information, you're sharing ideas. And that increasing interconnectivity is also making our world increasingly interdependent. We begin to expect certain things from people we know or the platforms that you know online. And also, you are sure that your expectations are going to be fulfilled. For example, if there's an earthquake in any part of the world, you obviously will find either someone you know in that area or some news portal of that area. And you don't need governments to do that for you. You can do it yourself. So in that sense, the world is extremely connected is the first reality. And what happens to nation states? No nation state, now howsoever powerful that nation state can be, imagine United States. They can no longer solve their problems or harness their opportunities on their own. They on every issue need to work with other nations, more often with like-minded nations, as we say. So if you close your eyes, think of the 5 big challenges that India has. You will realize not one of those challenges India can deal with by itself. It will have to work with other countries. So what that means is that foreign policy is an expanding field. So much expanding that it includes all of you. In fact, let me say all of you are doing a little bit of foreign policy every day. For example, there is an intercity relationship. Cities are sister cities. Maybe Bombay and Shanghai, Chennai and Qingdao, or like that. Universities have MOUs and agreements with hundreds of universities around the world. So mayors have their own meetings. So fundamentally, all of you, sports ministries are doing foreign policy of global sports events. Education ministries are doing education connections with around the world. Agriculture ministries are doing, every ministry, every city, every part of government, and every one of us is doing little bit of foreign policy because hundreds of your friends around the world, maybe they know about India from you, whatever you told them. So foreign policy is a domain which is exponentially expanding. Now, what is the task of that foreign policy? I mean, then what is the foreign ministry doing if everybody, you and me, are doing foreign policy? We are still governed by nation states, and Ministry of External Affairs or Foreign Affairs, their job is no longer limited to only doing foreign policy. Their job now is to broadly define for all of us, for cities, governments, for ministries, for business people, for you and me, for universities, colleges. Foreign ministries have to define the broad bandwidth within which there are do's and don'ts. What should we do and what we should not do? Now, the purpose of that exercise is for each nation to mold or create external environment in such a fashion that that external environment is not anti India pursuing its national goals. It should facilitate, it should make it easier for India to pursue its national goals. So India wants to share yoga as a health regime around the world. So Indian foreign policy has this as an important goal. And once you see the whole world doing yoga, whole world also becomes conscious of a country called India and what India is and how did yoga originate in India. Several examples can be given. So fundamentally, foreign policy is aiming to mold external environment in such a fashion that it helps India to achieve its national objectives. Now, in doing that, in molding that international environment, foreign policy uses many tools. These are the tools that foreign policy uses. It can use war. You see, now war is happening between Israel and Hamas, war is happening between Russia and Ukraine, many other wars. But less than wars, foreign policy also uses the tool of sanctions. You are hearing about how all Western nations have imposed economic sanctions on Russia. Now, if you travel to Russia, you cannot use your international credit cards anymore there. You have to use a local Russian credit card. Whereas everywhere around the world, you can use your credit cards and travel very easily. But nations also use spying. They have intelligence agencies. They use investments, they use trade, they use international law. If I have a problem with another country, I could go to International Court of Justice, I could go to Permanent Court of Arbitration in Hague, I could go to International Criminal Court. There are legal institutions. One can also use international organizations, World Trade Organization or World Tourism Organizations or World Health Organization and so on. Then there are also international norms evolved over a period of time. In last few decades, human rights have become very important norm. And if a country is seen doing ethnic cleansing, then there is something called right to protect doctrine. International community, UN Security Council can dispatch forces and sometimes even change the government, remove the leader. Democracy is another important norm. I come from disarmament studies, so nuclear taboo is another important norm. So foreign policy uses all these tools to create or mold external environment such that it is friendlier, it is helping each country, in our case India, to pursue its national objectives. Now, diplomacy is also a tool of foreign policy. I put it separately because diplomacy in that sense is all pervasive. It pervades in all other tools. Diplomacy operates in war, diplomacy operates in spying, in sanctions, in investments, in trade, everything. So diplomacy also is fundamentally a tool of foreign policy. But as we are saying, foreign policy is everybody's business. Just like diplomacy is also becoming all pervasive, it's into everything. But yet, diplomacy is not foreign policy. We will discuss that. Diplomacy still remains a tool that serves your foreign policy goals. And foreign policy has goals that are national objectives, which is where foreign policy can help. And foreign policy also uses all the leverages. If India is a great cultural hub, we will use culture as our leverage. If India is a technology hub, we will use technology as our leverage. If India is a great democracy, we will use that as a leverage. If India has a lot of economic power, India is now rapidly growing economy, we use those leverages. So we also have leverages that make us pursue foreign policy goals in that sense. And diplomacy by itself is also called a process, it's called institution, it's also professional service. Diplomacy since ancient times began in a very different fashion because at that time transport and communications were very different. It was very difficult to go from one place to another place. It took sometimes weeks on horseback. It sometimes took months on the ship to go from one country to another. So usually when we started this whole institution of ambassadors in residence, that means someone from a foreign country is going to live in my country permanently and deal with the relationship of two countries. Initially, they were called plenipotentiaries because transport and communication was very slow. Plenipotentiary ambassadors had a lot of powers. They could take a lot of decisions on behalf of the emperor or the king because it was not easy to transport and communicate. So he was authorized to make decisions. And then, of course, when we started nation states, we normally say Treaty of Westphalia of 1648, we gradually moved into what we call professional service. Now, diplomats initially used to be close confidants of the emperor or the king, who the king could trust. Now, it is a professional service. And if you are a excellent, brilliant young person who wants to be a diplomat, you have to pass through an examination, then you have to go through a training, and you start your career in Indian Foreign Service. You don't have to be son of a king or nephew of a king as it was in ancient times. So we say that in ancient times, till early modern times, a good handwriting was very important for plenipotentiary ambassadors so that when the message reaches the king after 6 weeks or 6 months, the king should be easily able to read your message. You should be very articulate in your speaking so that the king in whose kingdom you are posted should be happy to listen to you. Now, diplomatic service is very complex. It has to do many, many things. Let me share with you what do our diplomatic missions do today compared to plenipotentiaries of ancient times till early modern times. Today, diplomatic service is a very specialist service. They are trained rigorously, and there are mid-career trainings also because they are doing very interesting specialized jobs. For example, the most important thing for a country like India, which is rapidly growing economy, going to be third largest economy, that is why we are discussing Viksit Bharat, is how to expand and make India's exports competitive. Why should world buy Indian products? Because that is how Indian economy will grow and become third largest. Perhaps you did not think of it that as an IFS officer, you will be doing this. About 15 years ago, in a very famous speech, Indira Nooyi addressing Indian ambassadors had said that in 21st century, ambassadors will be no different than salesmen in PepsiCo. So Most important thing is how to help your economy to grow and become powerful economy is to expand exports. Second, equally important is to attract foreign investments. If your country is growing very fast, then the world wants to come and invest in your country because that is where they will make profit. If they're investing in a country which is not growing rapidly, they will not make profits. So the world wants to invest in a country which is growing very fast. So I invest $1 and maybe I earn $2. So attracting foreign investments. Then, of course, wooing technology transfers, because historically, obtaining advanced technology has not been easy. Countries that achieved or made or innovated advanced technologies, they normally did not share that technology with everybody because that technology gave them advantage, gave them power, gave them special status. Or sometimes they shared it only with friends, or shared with lot of terms and conditions, or shared with lot of cost. So therefore, technology is developing around the world. How to make sure best technologies from around the world are able to come to India or come to the country where you are based. And therefore, our foreign service has to focus on wooing technology transfers to India. Then, of course, also focusing on what makes India unique. Is it tourism? Is it yoga? Is it Ayurveda? What is it? And creating niche markets so that world remembers of India for some niche market. That when they think of Ayurveda, they think of India. When they think of yoga, they think of India, the whole world. And creating those niche markets and then creating such global marketing networks. Sometimes you have to work with others. Maybe not only India does yoga, let us say some other countries also do yoga. Maybe they have different techniques. Maybe they have different historiography of yoga. So how to create those or networks of technology? You are hearing these days debates on semiconductors. There is a whole, sometimes we say chip, there is a book recently I was reading called The Chip War. Semiconductors is the most advanced technology that nations want to create a consortium. Only few nations should have that. So United States, Taiwan are countries that want to invest and manufacture semiconductor chips in India. How to do that networking? And then, of course, focusing on cultural connections, diaspora linkages. You see, in last 10 years, in India's foreign policy, cultural connections and diaspora connections have become very, very important part of foreign policy and diplomacy. And now comes the task for which diplomatic missions were first created. That is now much lower in the priority. Diplomatic missions were created fundamentally to look after what we call consular needs of our nationals. Let us say about 9 million Indians are in various Middle East countries. Whatever be their consular needs, our missions have to take care of those. And you have seen India has earned name around the world now to rescue Indian citizens from situations which are difficult when some conflicts and wars happen. It began in 1991 war in the Gulf area in Middle East, when Indian ships went there and brought Indian nationals back home for free. And the most recent example is that of Ukraine. 23,000 people were brought out of that war zone by Indian government for free. That is how originally these ambassadorial missions or resident ambassadors were created to look after our nationals, the French nationals in Great Britain, or Prussian nationals in France, or something like that. Now, something that makes you often interact with embassies in your city is much lower in the hierarchy, in the priority. These are consular services or visitors. Some Americans want to come to India. Our embassy will issue them visa or provide them information or connect them to various agencies in India. Those are consular services for the host country people who want to visit India. Now you see that is the original task, but now it is much lower in the priority. It's not the top priority now. And likewise, soliciting technical and financial assistance for development. Climate change, climate finance is a big debate these days. Now, perhaps you get an idea what our diplomacy does. Maybe you did not think of it in this fashion before. Another thing which is rapidly transforming what diplomacy does is globalization. I started by saying that we are all getting connected very rapidly. We are becoming interdependent. Something like a toothpaste that you use every morning, maybe the ingredients come from one country, they are manufactured in another country and packed in a tube that is made in another country, and marketing and selling controls are happening in another country. So this networking of what we call production chains or manufacturing chains is what is collectively called globalization. We are all becoming connected. Production lines are becoming interconnected. For example, you often hear India is the pharmacy of the world because we make very cheap generic medicines. But ingredients that we need to make those cheap medicines, from 70% to 90% of these we import from China. So, interconnection and interdependence. Therefore, globalization is driving diplomacy in a very different fashion. But let's first begin by saying, what is globalization? How do the experts tell us what globalization is? In a most simple fashion, globalization, in a general consensus definition, means abolition of all restrictions. See, nation states created very hard boundaries. You cannot enter a state without its permission. You need visa, you need permission. But globalization is telling us abolish all these restrictions, destroy all the boundaries, extinguish all the walls, economic, political, social, cultural, that come in the way of human development. See, now the focus is on human. You talk about human development, human security, that we are all ultimately human beings who are divided into nation states. And nation states are artificial. So if nation states artificially divide us and that somehow negatively impacts human development, we should do away with those things. But of course, within globalization, there are different proponents, there are different debates. Something globalization is good, something globalization is negative. So whether globalization is helping us eliminate poverty, for example, Jagdish Bhagwati, a great Indian scholar, global scholar now, he thinks, yes, globalization is helping us to deal with issues of poverty alleviation. Joseph Stiglitz, American scholar, thinks reverse. He thinks globalization is actually increasing discrimination, increasing inequality around the world, etc., etc. But they all collectively believe that in this rapidly changing phase of globalization, it is opening a new chapter for diplomacy. What is diplomacy? Diplomacy fundamentally, in a simple fashion, means all the cross-border activities, not of you and me, but those who are called agents of a territorial state. Diplomats fundamentally are officials representing Government of India, for example, a territorial state. So all the agents, now agents could also be, for example, sometime you could also send people who are not diplomats, but they are assigned as agents by Government of India. For example, in Indian embassies around the world, it's not only diplomats who are there. There are military men there. Sometimes there are medicine people there. All kinds of development engineers could be posted there. So those who are sent as representatives or agents of territorial state, whatever they do is called diplomacy. whatever they do in official capacity. Not that if they are cooking their food in the evening, that's not diplomacy. Whatever they do on behalf of state. Now, if that is what we are saying, that diplomacy is the cross-border activity of diplomatic agents of territorial state, globalization is undoing territorialization. We are talking of deterritorialization because we are all interacting on cyberspace, on virtual space, on open oceans, in outer space. Territoriality is becoming limiting factor over a period of time. So here, globalization, the strategies that it is using is basically weakening our sense of boundaries. For example, we travel so much now, but you never see the territorial boundaries of the state. What you see is airport. You go from one airport to another airport and you see customs agent sitting there. He stamps your passport and you enter that country. That means deterritorialization. You don't have to literally cross a land border or any river border or something, maritime boundaries, etc. So globalization, which is increasing transport and communication, is basically, in some sense, also undermining the old original task of diplomacy, because globalization is today powered by information technology, by trade, by flow of finance capital, flow of people, flow of cultures, food, and everything. So here we say that increasingly globalization is making non-state actors much more important. All the multinational corporations, all the international non-governmental organizations like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, World Social Forum, and so on. Even terrorists, they are becoming increasingly important determinants, important players, important forces in how foreign policy is conducted. And therefore, it is also true at the same time that as we shift from 20th to 21st century, even the state diplomacy has shifted away from political to more and more economic and cultural domains and cultural issues. So there is even shift in state diplomacy over a period of time. And what we are seeing here is, in that sense, with this globalization, even when we agree that yes, deterritorialization is happening, but interaction is increasing. So even if interaction is not on the land border, but through the air or through virtual space, state still has responsibility, and state is sometimes contesting, sometimes fighting. It is creating new rules, for example, to deal with social media, to deal with information technology. It has to create new legislations. And likewise, diplomacy has also to find new ways of how to pursue national goals of foreign policy in this changing phase of globalization, which is transforming. So then in 21st century, what are the priorities with the globalization? With globalization now, diplomacy is focusing on very interesting issues. Fighting harmful double taxation. So many countries work on what they call double taxation agreements. Agreement that if a product is taxed in India and it is going to, let us say, Dubai, it should not be taxed also in Dubai again, or vice versa. Product in Dubai coming to India, if it is taxed in Dubai, should not be taxed in India again. So no double taxation. Improving labor standards, antitrust regulations, transparency of hedge funds. You're hearing about so many revelations about various kind of documents that are coming out. Agricultural subsidies, how do they impact exports? So very interesting new areas are opening up for diplomacy to engage with and influence external environment in these domains in such a fashion that Indian farmer, Indian artisan, Indian craftsman is able to still survive and thrive and export things around the world. Of course, at the same time, the old activity has also continued and expanded. The old activity was to provide consular services to your nationals or visitors from abroad. That number has also constantly been increasing. More and more millions of people from India are traveling out of the country every year, and millions of people are coming into India every year. So here, to deal with this increasing onslaught, so much more work. What is diplomacy doing? What is that strategy that they are evolving around the world as to how to deal with so many new issues and expanding number of things to do what existed from ancient times? European Union, for example, decided to merge their sovereignty. So 27 countries have come together and they issue now just one visa. It's called Schengen visa. Some of you know it. So they collectively don't issue separate visas for Estonia, for Lithuania, for Sweden, for Britain is not in EU now. But they issue one visa. That means they can collectively join their forces and pool their resources together to deal with who are called outsiders of European Union. And they issue one visa to all of these people to come in. And within Schengen Treaty nations, they can move freely, no problem. But when they have so much force, they can now focus on being more stringent, being more careful in monitoring the compliance to all the rules, monitoring of any infringements, any threats that may come from outside Europe. So that is a new diplomatic method to deal with people who are coming in and going out, how to deal with them. Of course, the whole diplomatic discussions on areas of nuclear weapons, on terrorism, have also shifted the focus of states because they think waging wars is not possible. So they have shifted from the old-fashioned focus on waging wars to now securing peace. Securing peace is more important, and they want to secure peace at all costs. And therefore, it seems the original power of the state, which was its capacity to fight wars, it seems that power apparently is shifting to how peaceful a state is and how much peacemaking it is doing around the world. So you're reading now, for example, a scholar called Joseph Nye, who talks about soft power. Hard power is not as important now. Soft power is more important. Smart power is more important. And that is the use diplomacy makes in ensuring, for example, India is taking initiatives in accelerating the peace process in Ukraine crisis now. That has made security issues a shift from ministries of defense to ministries of external affairs because more focus is on peace rather than war. And therefore, it is the diplomatic service which is now focusing on how to ensure peace, and ministries of external affairs or foreign affairs are doing much more work. For example, many of the countries, when they have these counter-terror networks of various nations working together, sharing information, that is the nodal agency normally is not Ministry of Defense. Nodal agencies are Ministry of External Affairs or Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Counter-terrorism groups, for example, working groups are also hosted and located in Ministry of External Affairs. Diplomats often lead discussions on those and cooperation on those, sometimes supported by soldiers also. So what is this nature of global diplomacy that we are discussing now? Diplomacy remains, of course, as a tool of statecraft, a tool of foreign policy. Originally, of course, that was true, but now we also have something called international governmental organizations and international non-governmental organizations. International governmental organizations, United Nations is the easy example, but several other, about 1,200 such international governmental organizations. Similarly, international non-governmental organizations. Now, over a period of time, because of the time and space shrink, as we say, we are all getting connected. That has made these international governmental organizations very powerful. Very quick example would be World Bank and IMF. When they want to give any aid and assistance to any country, it can put conditions that I will give you assistance if you do these following 5 things. And international government or governmental organizations are now becoming just as powerful as nation states, but they are much bigger than nation states now. Imagine UN Security Council, uh, you know, deciding to launch a peace enforcement mission against Libya, where it can remove Gaddafi. So nation states are becoming less powerful, and international government organizations are appearing to be much more powerful. Now, diplomats, of course, manage foreign policy goals, but diplomacy today, therefore, is not just a means, because now we also have diplomacy of not just nation states, but also of international government organizations. That makes diplomacy very powerful. It is developing its own grammar, its own norms, its own nature, its own professional. And therefore, now sometimes it seems there is a greater overlap between foreign policy and diplomacy, because we now have something called uh, as international civil servants also. Now, when we talk of what fundamentally diplomacy has to do, and does international governmental organizations do the same, first thing diplomats have to look at is who to talk to, which often also means whether state A has given official diplomatic recognition to another state. When a new state is formed, it needs other sovereign states to recognize it, that it is also a sovereign state. Maybe sometime you read about Taiwan. Taiwan, which calls itself Republic of China, was seen as the real China for a long period of time, till about 1970s. People's, which is Communist China, People's Republic of China came in 1949, but much of the world did not recognize it as a nation state. They continued to think Taiwan is the real China. Now Taiwan is having less and less number of nation states recognizing it as real China. So that is very significant. Diplomatic relations happen only after diplomatic recognition. A state decides whether we will have diplomatic relations or we will not have diplomatic relations. So who to talk to is very significant. What language to talk with. Now you see Indian Prime Minister speaks in Hindi around the world. There is also a great demand that Hindi should be recognized as one of the languages of United Nations. So languages that are recognized as languages of United Nations have their advantage, because how we speak and write gives us power to influence the narrative, the agenda, the outcomes. So linguistic proficiency is very significant. Diplomats very often know more than one language. They know more than one international languages. Then what language? What is it? Official language? Is it working language? There are all kinds of categories that diplomats have to deal with. If some of you want to be foreign service official, you will know that diplomats have all kinds of writing tools: aid memoirs, about the PPR, memoranda, non-paper, MOUs. Then there are non-verbal communications where signaling is very important, or sometimes messages through third party or through friends are significant. And in that sense, it looks like confusion that often happens is that diplomats sometimes begin to think that they are agents or representatives of the government, which they are not. They are representatives of the state. They are not representatives of the party in power. They are representatives of the territorial state. That is why I said territorial state. And that confusion sometimes also creates limitations. So how is this shift visible in shift from form to content? What is the form and what is the content? Diplomacy fundamentally involves negotiations in everything, whether you're negotiating with bilateral relationships or multilateral relationships in regional organizations, international organizations. It fundamentally means negotiations lie at the core of the conduct of diplomacy from ancient times. Now, in more modern times, in 21st century, we don't like to call it negotiations. We call it balancing. Balancing between multiple varying interests. If you're talking to 25 nations, then they all have different national objectives, they have different national interests. Now we call it balancing between various national interests to calibrate them in such a fashion that India's interests are also counted as important. But if you look at 200 years or 2000 years, then we usually say negotiations is at the core of diplomacy. Now, in the negotiations, it is not the negotiations the way you do with the shopkeeper when you buy some clothes. Here, negotiations fundamentally is a very special form of communications. Power lies in communication. How do you communicate? And communication skills have to be really important to achieve that balancing, particularly when there are contradictory interests. For example, Indo-US nuclear negotiations. United States doesn't want any next country to become a nuclear weapon state. India wants to be the next nuclear weapon state. So there's a contradiction in what they want to do, but they are able to balance. So we are able to find how can we work together, achieve certain amount of cooperation. What is the template which provides that balancing paradigm for us? So India today is called a country with advanced nuclear technologies. US calls us in that fashion and has asked us to separate military establishments which are doing nuclear weapon research and civil nuclear establishments and allow them access to see our civilian nuclear establishments. Historically, for millions of years, diplomacy always relied on confidentiality and chemistry. People who are negotiating are talking to each other, they must respect and trust each other's confidentiality. And they must have certain chemistry, they must like each other, they must not hate each other. And that has stayed very central to diplomacy all these years. Of course, now we live in a very different world. I told you, every one of you is doing diplomacy. So media is also doing diplomacy. Media's diplomacy is much faster, much open. Media is able to debate on diplomatic issues. Media is able to give judgments on how they think things should happen, whether India and Pakistan should begin to talk to each other or not. You see these television debates. People write in newspapers, people write on social media, and that is much faster. State takes long time to debate, consider as to what it has to say. But an expert like me and you could be going on television and saying something much faster and in a much open space, anytime, anywhere. And that has given much greater push to what used to be called public diplomacy. Public diplomacy is how do you engage the public in making them understand what foreign ministries are doing. So the diplomats are not only negotiating with foreign countries, they are also negotiating with their own people. They're trying to talk to all various ministries. For example, if Ministry of External Affairs wants to sign a, let us say, nuclear agreement, now they have to take Ministry of Science and Technology along. They have to take the Atomic Energy Commission along. Not just that, they have to explain to Indian people why are they negotiating with the United States. That is where public diplomacy becomes also responsibility of diplomatic service. And fundamentally, public diplomacy tries to contextualize, tries to explain why the policy that India pursued in 1970s needs to now change in 2024. We need to explain that to our people, because if we don't explain to people, they get angry. In next election, the government will fall and it will create more chaos. So it is the task of diplomats to explain national objectives of foreign policy to not just around the world to other people and other societies, but also to their own people. But most important, compared to television, compared to social media, where anybody can write anything, public diplomacy is done by state and it uses only lawful means. and it is dependable. Researchers like me can use archives and rely on the information that I get in archives that come from these various documents that are a result of public diplomacy. But I cannot quote a social media and feel that it is a reliable source for research on foreign policy. So here, let's look at what is happening to public diplomacy. First of all, public diplomacy was always there, even at ancient times when we spoke of plenipotentiary ambassadors. They had to make friends in the country where they are posted. They had to explain to people as to what they want to do in cooperation with the country where they are posted. So that has always been there. Even before formally a phrase was created, public diplomacy, and it became a domain, a subdomain of diplomacy as to what is public diplomacy. So problem is, in today's world, public diplomacy means engaging with representatives of political parties. So an American ambassador is posted in India. He is constantly in touch with various political leaders, with trade unions, with business leaders, with labor unions, with civil society, with civil servants, with universities, media, everybody. Fundamentally trying to explain to them as to why United States is doing what United States is doing. Otherwise, we will misunderstand United States. So they have to create these domestic constituencies in the country where they're posted so that this country understands why is United States doing what it is doing and whether it is good for India to work together with United States. So that everybody will be in agreement when the government makes a decision to begin cooperation with United States. The aim here is to then develop networks of people who will not just understand but cooperate in that embassy's work in the country when they want to invite great leaders, great scientists, and engage in cooperation with India, for example. So when it comes to such kind of modern public diplomacy, they also use a lot of engagement with media. They distribute films, they distribute magazines, they organize all kinds of conferences, meetings, talks, fundamentally to generate that influence, create certain amount of American influence in Indian thinking so that we understand what they're doing a little better rather than just getting angry with them. But other than media diplomacy, now more recently, there is also something called cyber diplomacy. Cyber diplomacy is done by netizens, influencers on social media. What they speak is read by sometimes millions of people. Sometimes some people have hundreds and thousands of followers. And public diplomacy, before it makes a decision to speak its mind, before the spokesperson of, let us say, Ministry of External Affairs addresses a press conference and explains that issue, netizens and influencers have already spread around the world what they think is happening, what they think should happen, what is good out of it, what is bad out of it. That has created even more challenge for public diplomacy, but it has also created opportunities. So we also now have cyber diplomacy as part of public diplomacy. So state also, as part of public diplomacy, does its own cyber diplomacy. It also engages the world and its own citizens using the same platform, social media. Indian Prime Minister, for example, has world's largest followers on Twitter. So he or his office also uses to engage social media. And here, in that sense, make sure the netizens are not saying something which is harming India's national interest, and public diplomacy, therefore, now also includes cyber diplomacy. When we talk of shift with pressure of cyber diplomacy and media diplomacy, public diplomacy co-opting some of these things into it, it has shifted now from focus on influencing people to educating people, which is a greater objective. So now the diplomatic service, when it is engaged in public diplomacy, it is not trying to say, I'm trying to influence your opinion. I'm trying to educate you is the new focus. So that by educating, of course, the real intention is that listeners, whether they're in a host country or in a home country or around the world, will perhaps develop a better understanding of what a country is trying to do. But then public diplomacy has some challenges, simple challenges. Cyber diplomacy, because it is so rapid, if some of you have Twitter, it moves so fast. You put on a message, and within seconds, hundreds of other messages have come, and your message has really gone far beneath. It's lost in the crowd. So, because of that speed and scale, sometimes public diplomacy, to deal with this influence of cyber diplomacy, begins to focus on issues which are not really critical. Sometimes you feel that netizens are pushing public diplomacy into engaging with issues which are perhaps not the most important issues for that state, but because of the pressure from cyber diplomacy. It can also create problems of quantity versus quality. When you're focusing on too much speed, maybe there are errors in your information. So public diplomacy has to be careful that when it is becoming very, very fast, it doesn't end up not just deviating from real issues, but also focusing on quantity over quality. For example, do I want to tweet 2,000 messages every day, which 1,800 have some mistakes, or I want to only put 50 messages in a year, making sure they're accurate? That pressure also is there. And of course, it needs far greater and quick coordination with all the other stakeholders. If there's Ministry of External Affairs controlling, diplomatic services, looking at that, how national goals are to be pursued, and they are engaging public diplomacy on cyber diplomacy and cyberspace, they have to constantly take feedback from several other departments or ministries. For example, if they are writing something about terrorism issue happened in Kashmir, they have to check with other state government, with Home Affairs, Ministry of Home Affairs, maybe with other agencies like National Investigating Agency and so on. So that speed and scale is putting enormous challenge on diplomatic service in that sense, which is engaged in that sense. So fundamentally, what we are saying is that the whole canvas of diplomacy, the domain of diplomacy, has expanded exponentially, enormously. But what is most interesting, at the same time, it has seen greater stress on specialization. Sometimes we say, let us focus narrowly on specialization. So I am not kind of, becoming a journalist. I'm not trying to be know-it-all kind of thing. I'm trying to know only specialization. I'm specialist on this area. But diplomacy is now seeing both things happening simultaneously. It is expanding the canvas into whole new areas, becoming part of diplomatic engagements. Numbers of those activities increasing, people who are traveling are increasing, but also negotiations. Today, diplomats have to negotiate, for example, United Nations Convention on Law of the Seas, United Nations Convention on Outer Space, or Indo-US nuclear deal. They need to know all these specialization areas, and sometimes they co-opt people from other domains as well. Another fundamental change in diplomacy, I did mention of international governmental organizations. Because of the time and space shrink, I see that I will take maybe about 10 other minutes. It's already 5 o'clock. I should have been maybe faster than this. Multilateral diplomacy, particularly summit diplomacy, is becoming very popular. You often see, let's say, give an example of India-China leaders. If Chinese leader visits India, you will say, oh, he is visiting here after 5 years. But Indian and Chinese leaders may have met 25 times in international forums, in other international multilateral organizations. So multilateral interactions, not only of national leaders, but also diplomats, is happening much more regularly than in bilateral old-fashioned way. Now, that has been facilitated by modern technologies of transport and communication, and which has made multilateral diplomacy high in demand. And that has created multilateral organizations. I told you about 1,200 international governmental organizations. And because they are very super powerful kind of multilateral international organizations, they have their own civil servants. They are international civil servants. And just like national diplomats are always focusing on how to pursue national interests, international civil servants today focus on how to achieve interests of their international governmental organization. So international civil servants of, let's say, World Health Organization, they are not worried about India's national interest or China's national interest or United Nations or United States national interest. They are only worried about how to take forward WHO's interests forward. So they are not territorial states, they are international organizations. And they are emerging very, very powerful in that sense. And they're doing something completely different. And that is where I think many national civil servants today aspire to become international civil servants because of remunerations being better, exposure to the whole world being better. All kinds of advantages come by becoming not just national civil servants, but international civil servants, particularly if your country is least developed or developing country. Maybe United States diplomats may not be interested to become international civil servants, but they also very often control many of the international governmental organizations. For example, World Bank president is always an American citizen. These had begun, multilateral organization had started way back in 1874, Universal Postal Union. These multilateral organizations began simply nation states controlling them, nation states debating issues, nation states taking decisions, and multilateral organizations simply facilitating those conversations. Today, these international organizations have become very powerful. They have their own agenda, they have their own secretariat, they have their own constitution or convention, they have their own civil service. And it's very different kind of multilateral diplomacy that we notice happening now around the world. So what we are seeing here is that not many countries have presence in as many countries. For example, European Union, which is not a nation state, it's a multilateral European Union organization. It has embassies in 118 countries. Not many countries can afford to have embassies in so many countries. India, of course, has in much more. Then it also has many of its offices in other international governmental organizations. United Nations Development Program has presence in 177 countries. So imagine how powerful these multilateral organizations have come to be. And that has made multilateral diplomacy synonymous with what we call parliamentary diplomacy. What happens in parliament? Different parties try to push their own agenda. They want to make sure the laws are made in implementing the manifesto of my party. So parliamentary debates and some of these multilateral diplomacy debates are becoming very, very similar. And reverse of it, multilateral diplomacy happens at the top end, at the global level. Then at the bottom is subnational diplomacy. For example, in India's case, West Bengal has its own diplomacy because when it comes to relations with Bangladesh, West Bengal is very important. When it comes to relations with Pakistan, Punjab is very important. When it comes to relations with Sri Lanka, Tamil Nadu is very important. When it comes to relations with Nepal, Bihar is very important. So national leaders in New Delhi have to look after the interests of these provincial units also. So what we are saying, particularly in federations, in federal republics that India is, federal units, sometimes cities. Shanghai, for example, has GDP much larger than maybe 50, 60 countries from the bottom of the pyramid. It's very powerful municipality of a city. Similarly, federal units, like I gave example of Tamil Nadu, or West Bengal, or Punjab, they are also very significant in how foreign policy is run. So this is sometimes also called paradiplomacy or constituent diplomacy, which is where there's a direct role in foreign policy of federal units. And they carry enormous influence in how the foreign policy is going to be conducted. Is the Chief Minister of West Bengal willing to go with the Prime Minister to Bangladesh or not willing to go? It can influence success and failure of both diplomacy and foreign policy. And therefore, it's interesting to see how various party leaders, how various lobbyists, and we now have something called brand ambassadors. Not just nations have brand ambassadors. For example, tourism in India can have Amitabh Bachchan as a brand ambassador. But international governmental organizations, Human Rights Watch, for example, can have its own brand ambassador. And sometimes these brand ambassadors are celebrities, Hollywood stars or Bollywood stars. And they are much more visible than your state ambassadors. So they are also, in that sense, part of that constituent diplomacy, which is what we're discussing. Let me try to quickly close some of these. I want to make sure we engage you in discussion and listen to you. Then, of course, cultural diplomacy has become very, very powerful lately. Fundamentally, cultural diplomacy aims to make sure that the world outside and the world inside develops a more mature understanding of my country, who we are. For example, if there is a much more stereotype, romantic imagination of India, people will talk about ancient wisdom, ancient traditions, cultural diversity, or if there's a great utilitarian focus, then they'll start talking about retrogressive practices and social practices of India, pollution in Delhi, or poverty, and so on. How to develop a complex and more mature understanding of what are the strengths and limitations of my country is where cultural diplomacy becomes significant. Cultural diplomacy also helps in soft balancing, in creating bridging, particularly in difficult relations. Two countries having difficult relations, two countries starting a new relation can start with cultural relations to begin with, and then come to more difficult issues and go all the way to defense cooperation and so on. So that is also something which is becoming much more interesting part of diplomacy today. Let me close quickly by talking of future trends. Historically, you remember I said we started diplomacy in terms of plenipotentiaries. And we have come all the way now to 21st century, 2024, where Britain was the first country to start with what they called laptop ambassadors. Because today we live in a world of constant connectivity. Right now, you are connected with the world in real time. So when we had these longitudes, latitudes, altitudes, they're no longer relevant because now you can, in real time, right now, talk to any part of the world. Time zones were created so that I can send instructions to faraway place that please do this at your 9 a.m. I will be sleeping at that time. But now I can speak to them at their 9 a.m. directly by connecting on phone or on social media or whatever else. So in that new world, it looks like creating large mansions, buildings, cars, all kinds of equipment, housing for ambassadors. It's an old thing. I mean, if somebody was to now start asking you to uh, stop using laptops and start writing on paper, it could be strange for you. So perhaps now what we used to call resident ambassadors could be seen as perhaps much vulnerable, cumbersome, expensive, not very useful. And they are becoming more majestic rather than functional or effective. That is one view. And therefore, UK was the first country to start talking about laptop ambassadors or laptop diplomats. You only need a mobile phone and a laptop, and you could be going around the world, connecting with people where you're required, not just fully staying there forever. When you're needed, you will go there. This is how corporate sector works, for example. If in a corporate sector somebody is needed to work in Bangalore, they'll send him to Bangalore for 2 days and then he comes back. Reverse is also an argument, which means that because of globalization, there's a whole proliferation of new ideas, new issues, new actors, new engagements. As I mentioned to you, it's an exponential explosion of activities that diplomacy has to now deal with. And in that sense, it looks like that our expanding interdependence is throwing so much of added work for diplomats to pursue foreign policy goals. And for everything, you remember I started by saying for everything you need joint solutions. No nation can work by itself. It must work with others. And that means that institution of diplomacy has transformed. We today talk of cyber diplomacy, media diplomacy, summit diplomacy, international governmental organizations, and so on, where political executives are traveling on regular basis. Your national prime ministers are traveling all the time, interacting with other leaders all the time, taking decisions like never before. So the reverse view is that the responsibility of foreign policy and diplomacy has not just expanded enormously, but become extremely complex and needs that professional service to become far more specialists rather than journalists in coming times. Let me stop here. I took a little longer time than I should have. And let me stop here and hope that you will be able to discuss things. I hope you were hearing me when I was speaking.
Thank you so